She was Wall Street's worst nightmare, a ruthless billionaire heiress who fired executives for breathing too loudly. He was a night shift janitor just trying to buy his daughter asthma medication. What happened when their worlds collided on the 84th floor shouldn't have been possible. But it changed everything. To the financial world, Victoria Sterling was a force of nature, a corporate apex predator. At 28, she was the youngest billionaire CEO in Chicago, having inherited Sterling Global after her father, Harrison Sterling, suffered a fatal stroke. But she didn't just inherit the company. She ruled it with an iron fist that made her predecessors look like pushovers. The tabloids called her the billionaire's daughter, a moniker she despised. Behind the glass doors of the 84th floor at the Aon Center, her employees had another name for her, the Ice Queen. Victoria fired people with a casual flick of her wrist. Her personal assistants lasted an average of 11 days. She demanded perfection, operated on 3 hours of sleep, and believed empathy was a liability on a balance sheet. No one could handle her temper. When a multi-million-dollar acquisition of Rothwell Industries hit a snag, she famously threw a baccarat crystal vase at the wall, sending her chief operating officer, Richard Sterling, her own uncle, fleeing from the room. But while Victoria lived in the stratosphere of private jets and hostile takeovers, Arthur Davies lived entirely in the shadows. Arthur was 32, a single father, and the night shift custodian for the executive floors of Sterling Global. His world was defined by the scent of industrial floor cleaner, the hum of the freight elevator, and the crippling anxiety of medical bills. His 7-year-old daughter, Chloe, had severe asthma, and the specialized treatments were drowning him in debt. Arthur didn't care about corporate politics or stock prices. He cared about keeping his job so he could keep his daughter breathing. Arthur was entirely invisible to the executives who worked late. He was just a blue uniform, a mop, and a cart. Until the night of October 14th, it was 2:15 a.m. Arthur was buffing the Italian marble hallway outside the CEO's suite. The floor was supposed to be empty, but as he approached Victoria's mahogany double doors, he heard a sound that didn't belong in a corporate boardroom. Shattered glass, followed by a ragged, gasping sob. Cautiously, Arthur pushed the door open. The penthouse office looked like a war zone. Binders were shredded, a laptop was smashed against the window, and papers blanketed the Persian rug. Sitting in the middle of the chaos, clutching her chest and hyperventilating, was Victoria Sterling. She was having a full-blown panic attack. The stress of a leaked financial report had finally broken her. Any normal employee would have backed away slowly, terrified of the inevitable firing that would follow witnessing the CEO in a moment of weakness. But Arthur didn't see a terrifying billionaire. He saw the exact same panic he saw in his daughter, Chloe, when she couldn't catch her breath. His parental instincts overrode his fear of unemployment. He parked his cart, walked into the room, and sat down cross-legged on the floor, about 4 feet away from her. "Look at my hand," Arthur said, his voice a low, steady rumble in the cavernous office. Victoria snapped her head up, mascara running down her porcelain cheeks. "Get out," she choked out, trying to scramble backward. "You're fired. Security." "You can fire me tomorrow," Arthur replied calmly, not breaking eye contact. "Right now, you're going to look at my hand." He held up his calloused, chemical-stained hand, spreading his fingers. "We are going to trace the fingers. Breathe in when I go up. Breathe out when I go down. Just like a roller coaster." It was a grounding technique he used for Chloe. To a titan of industry, it was absurd, but the quiet, unyielding authority in his voice cut through her panic. Her lungs were burning. Desperate, her eyes locked onto his fingers. Up. She inhaled a jagged breath. Down. She exhaled. Up, a smoother breath. Down. For 10 minutes, the only sound in the multi-million-dollar suite was the synchronized breathing of the billionaire and the janitor. When her heart rate finally slowed to a normal rhythm, Victoria slumped against her desk, exhausted. She looked at Arthur, really seeing him for the first time, the faded name tag, the tired lines around his eyes, the cheap work boots. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "Arthur Davies, ma'am. Facilities management." He stood up, dusted off his knees, and grabbed a trash bag. Without another word, he began picking up the shattered glass of her latest tantrum. Victoria watched him, bewildered. "I was throwing things. I broke a $3,000 laptop. Aren't you going to ask if I'm okay? Aren't you terrified of me?" Arthur paused, tossing a broken keyboard into the bag. "Ms. Sterling, my 7-year-old throws her toys when she's overwhelmed because she doesn't know how to process her big feelings. I don't get terrified. I just put the toys in timeout. If you want, I can put your stapler in timeout." For a second, Victoria stared at him, aghast at the sheer audacity. Then, to her own absolute shock, a sound escaped her throat. It was a laugh, a genuine, breathless laugh. "Leave the glass," Victoria ordered, suddenly sitting up straighter, the ice returning to her veins, but her eyes calculating. "Be here tomorrow at 8 a.m. Suite 8400. Wear a suit. You're no longer a janitor." Arthur froze. "Ms. Sterling, I don't know anything about business. I have a daughter to support." "I don't need you to know about business," Victoria cut him off. "I have a building full of Ivy League sycophants who tell me what I want to hear and let me destroy myself. I need someone who isn't afraid to tell me to breathe. Your salary just quintupled. Don't be late." The next morning, the executive floor was buzzing with toxic gossip. When Arthur stepped off the elevator in a slightly ill-fitting, off-the-rack grey suit he had bought at a thrift store years ago, the silence was deafening. Victoria had created a new title for him, Executive De-Escalation Director. To the rest of the C-suite, it was a joke. To Arthur, it was a terrifying lifeline that could pay for Chloe's inhalers for the next 5 years. The hostility was immediate. Chief Financial Officer David Harrington, a shark in a Tom Ford suit who had been vying to manipulate Victoria into selling off the company's manufacturing division, cornered Arthur in the break room on his first day. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, cleaner," David sneered, pouring himself a macchiato. "But Victoria is unstable. She adopts strays when she's stressed. Enjoy the paycheck, but stay out of my way. If you try to weigh in on company matters, I will personally see to it that you never work in this city again." Arthur just calmly stirred his black coffee. "I only clean up messes, Mr. Harrington. Try not to make any." Arthur's role quickly became the stuff of corporate legend. He didn't look at spreadsheets. He watched Victoria. He became the only person on Earth who could handle the billionaire's daughter. During a vicious boardroom meeting where Victoria was screaming at the marketing team over a failed ad campaign, preparing to fire an entire department of 20 people, Arthur simply walked over to the head of the table. He ignored the terrified executives, placed a lukewarm grilled cheese sandwich and a bottle of water directly on top of her quarterly projections, and pointed a stern finger at her. "You skipped breakfast and you're projecting your blood sugar crash onto the marketing team. Eat the sandwich, Victoria, or I'm putting the whiteboard markers in timeout." The executives braced for an explosion. They waited for Arthur to be fired out of a cannon. Instead, Victoria glared at him, grabbed the sandwich, took a bite, and mumbled, "The font on the presentation is still terrible." But the screaming stopped. The firings were cancelled. Arthur's blue-collar pragmatism began bleeding into Victoria's business strategies. When she was paralyzed by the decision of whether to lay off factory workers in Ohio, To satisfy shareholders, Arthur drove her to a diner at 3 a.m. He explained the reality of what a lost paycheck does to a family, referencing his own struggles to buy Chloe's medicine. For the first time in her life, Victoria didn't look at employees as numbers. She restructured executive bonuses instead, saving the factory. Slowly, the Ice Queen was melting. She even demanded Arthur bring Chloe to the office one Saturday, when his babysitter cancelled. Victoria, the woman who supposedly hated children, spent 3 hours sitting on the boardroom floor, letting Chloe teach her how to braid hair while Arthur reviewed security protocols. But the fairy tale was a fragile illusion, and David Harrington was holding a sledgehammer. David's plan to gut the manufacturing division and sell it to a rival firm, Blackwood Capital, was being derailed by Arthur's newfound influence. David knew that to get to Victoria, he had to remove the shield she had built around herself. He had to destroy Arthur. Arthur's background in custodial work gave him an advantage no executive realized. He noticed what people threw away. Late one Thursday evening, while working with Victoria on a stress management schedule, Arthur walked past David Harrington's darkened office. Old habits died hard. He noticed the heavy-duty paper shredder was jammed and blinking red. Arthur walked in to unjam it, pulling out the half-shredded clump of paper. His eyes caught the logo on the shredded document. Blackwood Capital. Below it, partially intact, was a wire transfer route and a list of Sterling Global's proprietary manufacturing patents. The exact patents David had claimed were worthless in the last board meeting. Arthur's blood ran cold. David was committing corporate espionage. He was selling them out from the inside. Arthur carefully bagged the shredded evidence, planning to take it to Victoria the moment she arrived the next morning. But David Harrington hadn't survived a decade on Wall Street by being careless. He had a hidden camera in his office. The next morning, Arthur marched toward the CEO suite with the bag of evidence. Before he could reach the doors, corporate security surrounded him. David Harrington emerged from Victoria's office, looking incredibly smug, followed closely by a pale and devastated-looking Victoria. "Arthur Davies," the head of security barked. "Empty your briefcase." "What is this?" Arthur demanded, looking past the guards to Victoria. "Victoria, I have proof." "Empty it," David interrupted smoothly. A guard grabbed Arthur's worn leather satchel and dumped it onto the reception desk. Out tumbled Arthur's thermos, a child's drawing from Chloe, and 3 velvet jewelry boxes. One of the boxes popped open. Inside was the famous $250,000 diamond necklace that belonged to Victoria's late mother, a piece she kept locked in her private office safe. Arthur stared at the diamonds in horror. I've never seen that before in my life. Someone planted this. "We caught you on the security cameras sneaking into my office last night, Arthur," David said loudly, ensuring the gathering crowd of employees heard every word. "And when we checked the audit logs for the penthouse safe, your security badge was used at 11:45 p.m. You've been playing the saint, manipulating a vulnerable CEO, all while robbing her blind." Arthur looked desperately at Victoria. The woman who had fought off hostile takeovers, the woman who had laughed on the floor with his daughter, looked entirely shattered. Her walls were back up. The ice had returned. "Victoria," Arthur pleaded, his voice cracking. "You know me. You know I would never do this. Look at the shredded papers I found." "Stop," Victoria whispered, her voice colder than Arthur had ever heard it. She refused to look him in the eye. "My mother's necklace, Arthur. Really? I didn't take it." "Call the police," Victoria ordered David, turning her back on Arthur and walking into her office. "And get this thief out of my sight." Arthur Davies was escorted out of the Aeon Center, through the loading dock, the same way he had entered every night as a janitor. But this time, accompanied by 2 burly security guards and the crushing weight of a ruined life. Victoria had shown him 1 solitary ounce of mercy. She hadn't pressed formal criminal charges. She told the police it was an internal matter. But the damage was catastrophic. He was blacklisted. In the tightly knit corporate ecosystem of Chicago, a fired executive assistant accused of stealing a $250,000 heirloom from a billionaire CEO didn't just lose a job. He lost his future. Within a week, Arthur's life reverted to a nightmare. He took a brutal, under-the-table job hauling drywall for a shady construction crew just to keep the lights on in his cramped, 2-bedroom apartment. The bespoke suits Victoria had bought him hung in his closet like ghosts of a life that wasn't real. The worst part wasn't the physical labor or the agonizing betrayal. It was Chloe. Her asthma was worsening with the changing autumn weather, and without the premium health insurance Sterling Global provided, Arthur had to ration her emergency inhalers. Meanwhile, on the 84th floor, the Ice Queen had returned. But the throne felt remarkably cold. Victoria Sterling threw herself into her work with a viciousness that terrified her staff. She fired 3 department heads in 5 days. She slept in her office. She stopped eating anything that wasn't black coffee or catered sushi. But the silence in her penthouse suite was deafening. Every time she looked at the mahogany boardroom table, she expected to see a lukewarm grilled cheese sandwich. Every time her chest tightened with anxiety, she instinctively looked for a calloused hand to trace. David Harrington, however, was thriving. With Arthur out of the picture, David had successfully steered the board of directors toward the Blackwood Capital merger. He framed it as a strategic downsizing, liquidating Sterling Global's Midwestern manufacturing plants. It would gut thousands of jobs, but the shareholder payouts would be astronomical. On a rainy Tuesday evening, 3 days before the board was scheduled to sign the Blackwood deal, Victoria felt the familiar, terrifying tightening in her chest. A panic attack was coming. The financial reports on her desk began to blur. She gasped for air, her vision tunneling. Desperate, she squeezed her eyes shut and held up her own trembling hand. Up, she traced her thumb. Inhale, down, exhale, up, inhale. As her heart rate slowly stabilized, her mind achieved a sudden, crystal-clear sharpness. Arthur's voice echoed in her head. I only clean up messes, Mr. Harrington. Try not to make any. Victoria opened her eyes. Something had always bothered her about that morning. Arthur was practically a Boy Scout. He had the opportunity to extort her the very first night he found her crying on the floor. Yet he had asked for nothing. Why would a man who meticulously budgeted his grocery bills suddenly steal a highly recognizable diamond necklace that would be impossible to pawn? And then she remembered the words Arthur had desperately shouted as security dragged him away. Look at the shredded papers I found. Victoria slammed her hand on her intercom. Sarah, she called out to her terrified, newly hired assistant. The day Arthur Davies was fired, what happened to the items he dumped on the reception desk? Security logged them into the basement lockup, Ms. Sterling, Sarah replied hesitantly. Bring me his bag. Now. 10 minutes later, Victoria dumped the contents of Arthur's worn leather satchel onto her pristine glass desk. Chloe's crayon drawing fluttered to the floor, and there, stuffed into the bottom, was a transparent trash bag filled with mangled, shredded paper. Victoria spent the next 4 hours painstakingly taping the strips together like a forensic jigsaw puzzle. By 2 a.m., the picture was complete. It was a drafted contract and a series of offshore wire transfer receipts. David Harrington wasn't just selling the manufacturing division. He was receiving a massive illegal kickback from Blackwood Capital to tank Sterling Global's stock right before the sale. He was committing corporate treason. But what about the necklace? What about the security logs? Victoria logged into the mainframe. The audit log showed Arthur's badge had accessed her private safe at 11:45 p.m., the night before he was fired. But as Victoria stared at the timestamp, a cold realization washed over her. At 11:45 p.m. that night, Arthur wasn't in her office. He was on a FaceTime call with her, helping her talk through a supply chain crisis while simultaneously helping his daughter with her math homework. He had been on her iPad screen for a full hour. It was physically impossible for him to be in two places at once. David Harrington had cloned Arthur's security badge. Victoria leaned back in her chair, the weight of her colossal mistake crushing the breath out of her. She had let a venomous snake manipulate her into destroying the only person in the building who genuinely cared about her. The Ice Queen didn't cry, but as she picked up Chloe's crayon drawing, a single tear slipped down her porcelain cheek. It was time to go to war, but she couldn't do it alone. The Southside apartment complex was a far cry from the glittering high-rises of downtown Chicago. The hallway smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and damp carpet. When Arthur opened his apartment door at 6 a.m., dressed in a faded flannel shirt and covered in drywall dust from his night shift, he froze. Standing in his dilapidated doorway, flanked by two massive bodyguards, was Victoria Sterling. She wasn't wearing her usual pristine Armani power suit. She was wearing a simple trench coat, her hair pulled back, looking exhausted. "You're trespassing, Miss Sterling," Arthur said, his voice flat, devoid of the warmth she so desperately missed. He moved to close the door. "I was on FaceTime with you at 11:45 p.m., Victoria blurted out, wedging her designer heel into the doorframe. "You couldn't have opened the safe. David cloned your badge. I taped the shredded papers together, Arthur. I know everything." Arthur stopped pushing. He looked at her, his jaw tight. "I told you that 3 weeks ago, but you chose to look at my cheap shoes and my blue-collar background, and you believed the guy in the Tom Ford suit. You didn't just fire me, Victoria. You broke my daughter's heart. She asks when Auntie Vic is coming over to play dolls. I have to lie to her." The words struck Victoria like physical blows. "I was a coward," she whispered, her voice trembling. "My whole life, people have only ever wanted my money or my company. You just wanted to make sure I ate lunch. I panicked. I let the ice take over. And I am so sorry." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small, insulated pharmacy bag. "I brought Chloe's specialized inhalers, 6 months' worth, fully paid for." Arthur looked at the bag, the tension in his shoulders slowly breaking. He stepped back, opening the door wider. "Coffee is black. I don't have macchiatos." For the next 3 hours, sitting at a wobbly Formica kitchen table, the billionaire and the janitor hatched a plan. Arthur didn't just have an intimate knowledge of the company's trash, he knew the building. He knew the maintenance shafts, the server room blind spots, and most importantly, he knew the night shift IT staff who hated David Harrington's guts just as much as he did. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for Friday at 9 a.m. The atmosphere in the 84th floor boardroom was electric. David Harrington stood at the head of the long table, exuding triumph. The contracts with Blackwood Capital were neatly arranged in leather binders. The board members, 12 of the wealthiest, most influential investors in the state, were murmuring their approval. "Ladies and gentlemen," David began, adjusting his silk tie. "Today, we trim the fat. We evolve. By divesting from these obsolete manufacturing plants, we ensure Sterling Global's dominance for the next decade." "We aren't divesting from anything, David." A sharp voice cut through the room. The heavy mahogany doors swung open. Victoria Sterling strode in, radiating absolute authority. But it was the man walking beside her that made the entire room gasp. Arthur Davies was wearing a dark, perfectly tailored navy suit. His posture was impeccable, his gaze unwavering. He looked less like a former janitor and more like an executioner. "Security!" David shouted, his face draining of color. "What is this man doing here? He is a thief and a trespasser." "Security works for me, David," Victoria said smoothly, taking her seat at the head of the table. "And Mr. Davies is my newly appointed Chief Operating Officer. He has every right to be here." The board erupted into chaos. "Victoria, this is madness!" Her uncle, Richard, sputtered. "You can't put a custodian in the C-suite." "I can, and I did," Victoria stated, slamming her palm on the table, silencing the room instantly. "Because this custodian is the only person in this room who isn't actively trying to rob me blind." Arthur stepped forward, plugging a flash drive into the boardroom's projection system. The massive screens flickered to life. "A week ago," Arthur said, his voice carrying that same calm authority he used to de-escalate Victoria's panic attacks. "Mr. Harrington accused me of stealing Miss Sterling's necklace. But a funny thing happens when you treat the IT and maintenance staff like ghosts, David. You forget they control the building." The screen displayed a hidden security camera feed from the IT server room. It clearly showed David Harrington logging into the mainframe security terminal 2 nights before the theft, initiating a badge cloning sequence. "That's doctored footage!" David yelled, sweating profusely. "We also pulled the offshore routing numbers you tried to shred," Arthur continued relentlessly, bringing up the taped-together documents Victoria had reconstructed, followed by a digital bank trace. "With the help of our IT department, we subpoenaed the IP logs. The $45 million kickback from Blackwood Capital was deposited into a shell company registered to your brother-in-law." The boardroom descended into a stunned, deadly silence. Victoria leaned forward, resting her chin on her steepled hands. "I've already forwarded everything to the SEC and the FBI, David. In fact, if you look out the window, you'll see a few unmarked sedans pulling into the plaza." David lunged across the table, his composure entirely shattered. But Arthur was faster. With a swift, practiced movement, Arthur grabbed David by the lapels of his expensive suit and slammed him back into his leather chair, pinning him there. "Breathe in, David," Arthur whispered coldly. "Breathe out, because you're going to be in a very tight, very small cell for a very long time." When the FBI escorted a handcuffed David Harrington out of the boardroom in front of the entire company, the applause from the bullpen was deafening. The aftermath of the boardroom coup reshaped Sterling Global entirely. Victoria cancelled the Blackwood merger, saving thousands of manufacturing jobs. She didn't just keep Arthur as COO, she made him a full partner. His blue-collar pragmatism, combined with her ruthless financial acumen, turned the company into an unstoppable, yet surprisingly ethical, juggernaut. 6 months later, the 84th floor penthouse looked drastically different. The sterile, cold environment was gone. Arthur walked into the CEO's suite without knocking. He found Victoria sitting on the floor, barefoot, her designer blazer discarded on a chair. Sitting next to her, laughing uproariously, was Chloe. The two of them were intensely focused on a massive, complex Lego castle. "I thought we had a quarterly earnings call in 10 minutes, Arthur said, leaning against the doorframe with a soft smile. Victoria looked up, brushing a strand of hair out of her eyes. The ice was completely gone, replaced by a genuine radiant warmth. "The earnings can wait, Arthur," Victoria smiled, snapping a Lego drawbridge into place. "Chloe and I are negotiating a peace treaty with the dragon. It requires my full attention." Arthur walked over, sitting down on the Persian rug next to the two most important people in his life. He had spent years trying to scrub the dirt off the floors of the wealthy, only to discover that sometimes the most broken things just needed someone willing to sit in the mess with them. Did this story of power, betrayal, and unexpected redemption keep you on the edge of your seat? The corporate world can be ruthless, but sometimes the greatest strength comes from the most invisible people. If you loved this billionaire drama, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling real-life stories. Drop a comment below on your favorite plot twist.